My name is Noelle Hart, 32 years old. The cemetery looked carved from winter, even though October hadn't quite surrendered its last gold leaves. The air bit through my black dress, threading cold into my ribs. I could hear the mechanical whir of the lowering device, a sound too precise for grief, and my Aunt Greta's soft crying beside me. A sound too human for this machine-like day. For 3 days, I'd stood where people told me to stand, shook the hands that reached for me, repeated, "Thank you for coming," until the words tasted like chalk. I had practiced not flinching at Vivian's barely concealed satisfaction, the small, varnished smiles she thought no one noticed. I had promised myself I wouldn't make a scene. "Before we let Sterling rest," Vivian said, stepping forward in a designer black suit that probably cost more than most mortgage payments, "there's something everyone needs to know about Noelle." My name on her tongue sounded like a stain. She timed it for the moment. The pastor lowered his voice, and the casket hovered. For the moment, my father could not speak for himself, and the entire family had gathered to witness a final kindness. The calculation of it made my stomach turn. "This girl," she pointed at me like an attorney introducing evidence, "has been living a lie for 32 years. She's not Sterling's biological daughter." Gasps shivered through the group like a wind no weather report had predicted. Uncle Theodore, my father's brother, dropped his prayer book into the mud. My cousin Mallory grabbed my arm. Someone behind me whispered, "Oh my God." The funeral director, who had been politely distant, leaned almost imperceptibly forward. In that moment, the grave wasn't a place of rest. It was a stage, and Vivian had waited for her cue. "You're lying," I managed, but my voice sounded far away, like it belonged to a person I was trying to protect. "Am I?" Vivian slid a manila folder from beneath her coat. "Sterling's blood type was O negative. Noelle is AB positive. It's genetically impossible for him to be her father. I have medical records." She held up photocopies like cards in a rigged deck. Beside her, my stepbrother Dexter, 6 feet of expensive tailoring and practiced smirk, watched my face like he was waiting for the best place to land a punch. "Sorry, sis," he said, dragging the word until it snapped. "Guess you're not really family after all. Mom's already talked to lawyers about the will." The ground tilted. My father had been dead exactly 3 days. 3. And they were already working to erase me from his life. Sterling had taught me to ride a bike in our driveway, had walked me down the hallway on my first day of teaching, had called me every Sunday night just to hear about my week. He was the constant rhythm under everything I did. And here, at the lip of his grave, Vivian was telling our family, 47 relatives and a handful of friends, that the anchor of my life was a fiction. "How dare you?" Aunt Greta found her voice, shaky, furious. "At his funeral, Vivian. Have you no shame?" "I'm telling the truth," Vivian said in that gentle, sugared tone she used when she wanted to sound innocent. "Everyone deserves to know. Sterling's real legacy belongs to his actual blood, to Dexter." Murmurs thickened. The pastor clutched his Bible like a life preserver. My fingers went numb. Eugene Holbrook cleared his throat. He'd been a fixed point at the periphery, standing near the old oak with a rain-dark briefcase. Eugene, Mr. Holbrook to almost everyone, had been my father's lawyer and friend for 20 years. He'd come to my high school graduation, to my college graduation, even to my first parent-teacher night when nerves shook my hands. He moved now with deliberate quiet, the kind a courtroom trains into you. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, his voice clean as a bell in the cold air. "Before you continue this spectacle, perhaps we should discuss what Sterling left in my care." For the first time that day, something in Vivian's face faltered. The muscles around her mouth tightened. Her fingers pinched the folder hard enough to crease the paper. "What are you talking about?" she asked, but her words didn't carry the same distance as before. Dexter's eyes flicked to her, quick and sharp, as if he were checking a cue card. "6 months ago," Mr. Holbrook continued, stepping between Vivian and me, placing himself like a wall, "Sterling came to my office with very specific instructions and a sealed package. He was thorough." "This is ridiculous," Vivian said, but her voice had lost its edge. I noticed, distantly, the smallest tremor in her hand as she tucked a blonde hair behind her ear, an old habit she usually controlled in public. Dexter shifted his weight, not out of grief, but calculation, the way a chess player adjusts for a new move. He said, Mr. Holbrook glanced at me, and there was something like apology in his eyes, and I quote, "If Vivian tries to claim Noelle isn't my daughter at any point after my death, you are to immediately read this letter and play this recording." The cemetery went very quiet. Even the breeze seemed to hold its breath. 47 members of the Caldwell family and a smattering of longtime employees stilled into statues. The pastor stepped back. The funeral director stopped pretending not to watch. Somewhere a crow barked and then thought better of it. "This is theatrical nonsense," Vivian said, but her footing wasn't steady. "I have medical records." "As do I," said Mr. Holbrook. He opened the briefcase and removed a large envelope with my father's handwriting on it, to be opened only under circumstances discussed. Below it, in the careful script I'd know in a crowd of 1,000, "My daughter Noelle is my greatest achievement." My eyes burned, and for a second I hated my own body for the way tears insisted on existing. Even here, even now, Dad was still protecting me. A strange memory flashed. The week before he died, I'd watched him fold an unmarked envelope into his jacket after a bank visit, his hands steady, his face unreadable. "Grown-up errands," he'd joked, and then he'd burned a pot roast, trying to talk to me about nothing and everything. Preparations, I realized. He'd been preparing for this exact theater. "We don't need to do this here," Vivian said, throat tight. "We can take this private." "Oh, but you made it public," Aunt Greta said, voice like a knife. "You started this show. Let's see how it ends." I felt Mallory's fingers slide down my sleeve and lace into mine. Uncle Theodore positioned himself on my other side like a guard. A cousin I'd never particularly liked lifted her phone, recording. The family was dividing, reorganizing around a new gravity. I couldn't feel my toes. "Read the letter," I said. My voice surprised me. It didn't sound broken. It sounded like the kind of voice a teacher uses when a classroom is about to spin out. Calm, ironed flat. Let everyone hear what my father had to say. Mr. Holbrook broke the seal. The sound, paper tearing, seemed louder than it should have been. As if truth had a volume knob we'd just turned up. He slid out several pages. His reading glasses caught a sliver of gray sky. Vivian tried for one last posture. "You're bluffing, Eugene." "You know he isn't," Dexter muttered, barely moving his lips. It was not loyalty, it was strategy. He was measuring odds now, looking past this moment at the next. I saw it with cold clarity, and part of me hated him for it. Another part noticed the boy he'd been, standing at the edge of every room, waiting for his mother to tell him who he was. "Before I begin," said Mr. Holbrook softly, "know that what I'm about to read was notarized and witnessed. Sterling also lodged copies with 2 outside firms to be released, if anyone contests it." A ripple moved through the crowd. I watched Vivian swallow, watched a nerve flicker in her jaw. The pastor's hand tightened on his Bible. The funeral director shifted on his heels. For the first time in days, I felt something other than numbness. It wasn't relief and it wasn't victory. It was the sensation of stepping onto a floor and finding that it holds. Mr. Holbrook cleared his throat. "To my beloved daughter Noelle, and to all present." He began to read, and my father's voice rose through the words like heat from a summer road, familiar, steady, impossibly near. Vivian's shoulders drew back. Dexter's chin lifted. A robin landed on the oak and tilted its head as if listening. I had the strangest thought that the earth itself was waiting. The casket descended another inch. The wind combed the grass flat and then let it go. I braced, not for impact, but for the shape of truth I couldn't yet see. In the manila folder, Vivian's papers winked like false coins. In Holbrook's hands, my father's handwriting was a pulse. Whatever came next would hurt. It would also hold. The sound of my father's words still rang in my ears long after we left the cemetery. But before I tell you what was written in that letter, you need to understand the kind of man he was, what he meant to me, and what kind of cracks Vivian had slowly been carving into our world long before his death. Dad's name was Sterling Caldwell. To everyone in town, he was the man behind Caldwell and Family Hardware, a string of 3 hardware stores known for fair prices, honest advice, and the kind of handshake trust people said didn't exist anymore. To me, he was the man who taught me to build things that lasted, from birdhouses to faith in myself. Every Saturday since I could remember, we'd visit one of the stores together. The smell of sawdust, motor oil, and steel bolts was the scent of my childhood. Dad would walk through each aisle, nodding to his employees by name, asking after their families. He'd let me help with inventory, teaching me how to count nails and label boxes while he told stories about my grandfather, how the first store started with nothing but a $1,000 loan and a dream. "This will all be yours someday, Noe," he'd say, using my childhood nickname. "Not just the stores, but the legacy. People trust the Caldwell name because we've earned it." He was a man who believed that everything broken could be fixed, given the right tools and enough patience. And for years, it felt like that was true, until Vivian arrived. I was 22, fresh out of college, newly hired as a third-grade teacher. Dad had been alone for 15 years since Mom died. He'd gone on dates here and there, but none ever lasted. Then one day he came home from a Chamber of Commerce dinner and said, "I met someone." Vivian was beautiful in that intimidating, glossy way. Every hair in place, manicured nails, clothes that whispered money even when she claimed she was struggling. She said she'd been through a rough divorce, was trying to rebuild her life with her teenage son, Dexter. She told Dad he was exactly the kind of steady man she needed. And Dad, God bless him, believed her. He brought her to Sunday dinner 2 weeks later. She brought an apple pie that looked like it belonged in a commercial. She laughed at Dad's corny jokes, asked about his stores, and kept touching his hand like she was drawing strength from it. But when she looked at me, her smile never quite reached her eyes. After that, she was everywhere, helping at the stores, joining family dinners, even suggesting redecorations for the house. She was careful at first, always pretending to include me. "You have such great taste, Noelle," she'd say sweetly, before moving my mother's photos into the hallway for better light. It took months before I realized that every compliment was just a quieter way of erasing me. Dexter followed her lead. At 15, he was already taller than me, with his mother's sharp cheekbones and even sharper tongue. He called me sis with a smirk, like it was a joke we both knew wasn't true. He'd make comments when Dad wasn't around, little digs about how the stores needed a man's touch, how I'd make a great preschool teacher because I liked playing with toys. Dad didn't see it. Dexter was too good at pretending when he was in the room. Around Sterling, he was polite, eager to learn, always asking about the business, and Vivian fed that image. "He's got such potential, Sterling, just like you at that age." But Dad wasn't blind. He noticed the tension. I remember one evening on the back porch, the sunset staining the sky orange, when he said quietly, "Noelle, I know you and Vivian aren't close. I'm not asking you to love her. Just try to understand. Dexter's had a rough time. Maybe we can be what they need." I tried. God, I really did. I helped Dexter with his algebra, invited him to volunteer at the store charity drive. He always found a way to ruin it. "You sure Dad isn't paying you for this?" he'd joke. "You act more like an employee than family." It stung, but I bit my tongue. I thought if I kept showing kindness, eventually it would matter. Then came the wedding. Vivian made it a spectacle. Silk tablecloths, imported flowers, a guest list that read like a society page. I stood beside Dad as his best woman, watching him beam at the altar like he'd found peace again. I told myself that if she made him happy, that was enough. But when I caught her glancing at his gold watch during their vows, as if calculating its worth, a chill ran through me that I couldn't shake. After they married, the changes came slowly. "Sweetheart," Vivian would say, "wouldn't you be more comfortable eating in your room while Dexter and I help Sterling with the new business plan?" Or, "Didn't Sterling tell you? We're changing the Saturday store visits. Dexter needs that bonding time with his new father." Each exclusion was so polite it was almost impossible to argue with. By the time I realized I'd been edged out of our rituals, the damage was done. Still, Dad tried to balance it. He made sure our Saturday visits continued, just earlier in the morning before Vivian woke up. "Nobody replaces my Noe," he'd said firmly. And he never missed our Sunday night calls, even when Vivian's voice echoed faintly in the background, complaining about paperwork. 3 weeks before he died, he called me over for dinner, just the two of us. He made pot roast, his signature dish, the one Mom had taught him. We ate in silence for a while until he put down his fork and took my hand across the table. His fingers were still rough from years of work, his palms stained faintly with oil. "Noelle, there are things I need to tell you," he said. I felt my stomach tighten. "What things?" He shook his head. "Not yet. The time isn't right. Just remember this. No matter what anyone says after I'm gone, you're my daughter. Blood doesn't make family. Love does. and I've loved you since the moment your mother told me she was pregnant." "Dad," I whispered, "are you sick?" He smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just getting my affairs in order. A man my age should be prepared. I've made sure you're protected. Mr. Holbrook has everything. Trust him if anything happens." He squeezed my hand, and for a moment, it felt like nothing could break us. 4 days later, he was gone. A massive heart attack, quick and merciful, they said. He'd been at the original store, checking inventory early in the morning. They found him sitting at his desk with a photo of Mom and me from my graduation in his hand. The funeral that followed was beautiful, exactly what Dad deserved. Employees from every store formed an honor guard. The church overflowed with customers, friends, and families whose lives he'd quietly helped. During the eulogy, I told them how he taught me that business wasn't about money, but about trust. That he once stayed open until midnight on Christmas Eve so a mother could fix her son's bike. I only broke once when I said he fixed things with love. Broken hearts, broken spirits, broken families. He was my hero. Vivian sat in the front row, perfectly composed in a black Chanel suit. Dexter beside her scrolled his phone during the hymns. They'd both insisted they were too grief-stricken to speak. Yet I'd overheard Vivian that morning discussing property assessments on the phone. The graveside service was smaller, family mostly. The hill overlooked the town. You could see all 3 stores from there if you knew where to look. October had painted the trees gold, my father's favorite season. God's way of showing off, he used to say. As the pastor finished the final prayer, as we whispered, "Amen," the funeral director began to hand out roses for the casket. And that's when Vivian stood up. Not to say goodbye, not to cry, but to announce to everyone that the life I'd lived was a lie. That was the moment the world cracked open. And if I'd known what was waiting inside that sealed envelope Mr. Holbrook now held in his hands, I might have been even more afraid. The sky dimmed to a bruised gray as Mr. Holbrook unfolded the letter, his hand steady in the chill. The paper, lined with my father's familiar handwriting, fluttered slightly in the wind. I could almost smell the faint trace of sawdust and motor oil that always clung to him, as if his very presence carried the scent of work and honesty. "To my beloved daughter, Noelle, and to all present," he began, his voice measured, resonant, and cutting through the silence like the strike of a gavel. "If you are hearing this, then what I feared has already happened." Vivian's jaw tightened, her hand gripping her folder so tightly her knuckles whitened. "Oh, please," she hissed, though it was softer now, defensive rather than triumphant. Mr. Holbrook continued reading. "Vivian has chosen to tell only a fraction of the truth, as she has so many times before, so I will tell the whole story, documented, verified, and witnessed, so that those who loved me will know who my daughter truly is." The murmurs that had started when Vivian first spoke were gone. Every sound, every breath, was swallowed by the weight of my father's voice echoing through the lawyer's steady tone. "I have known since Noelle was 8 years old that she is, without question, my biological daughter. What Vivian does not know is that I had already confirmed this. The matter of blood types is meaningless without context, and I have the medical records to prove it." My throat tightened. I hadn't even realized I'd been holding my breath. Vivian tried to interject. "You expect us to believe this?" But Mr. Holbrook didn't look at her. "Let me finish, Mrs. Caldwell," he said calmly, his eyes fixed on the page. "Because your turn to speak is coming, and I suspect it will be less comfortable than you think." A ripple of quiet amusement, grim, restrained, passed through the mourners. Even Dexter flinched. 3 years before I met Vivian," the letter went on, "I had a vasectomy. My late wife, Angela, nearly lost her life giving birth to Noelle, and we both agreed one child was enough. I reversed the procedure after Vivian and I married, when we tried to have children together, unsuccessfully. However, Dexter was already 5 when I met Vivian." A low gasp ran through the crowd. "I have DNA proof that Dexter is not my biological son," Holbrook read. "But I chose to raise him as my own, because that's what a father does. I tried to give him the structure and love his mother seemed unwilling to provide. But I have known from the beginning that he is not my blood." Vivian's face blanched, the wind pulling at her hair as if the world itself was mocking her attempt at composure. "That's impossible," she whispered. "He's lying. Sterling would never say that." Mr. Holbrook didn't respond. He simply turned to the next page. "I also know," he read, "that Vivian's claims about Noelle's parentage are built on half-truths and convenient omissions. She is correct that my blood type and Noelle's are different. But Angela, Noelle's mother, was adopted. Her biological father, a man named David Brennan, carried AB-positive blood. Angela discovered this during her cancer treatment when she needed medical history. Before she passed, she told me everything. The air grew heavy, thick with disbelief. I felt a tremor move through my hands, through my entire body. Mom had been adopted? She'd never told me. She made me promise not to complicate Noelle's life with this information, the letter continued, and I honored that promise. Because family is not measured by shared DNA, but by the love that builds it. Noelle is my daughter in every way that matters, and in every way science can measure. When she was 8 and needed emergency surgery after a bike accident, the hospital required a paternity confirmation for blood compatibility. That test confirmed a 99.98% probability of paternity. I kept the results sealed to spare her from the confusion Vivian is now so eager to cause. I pressed my fingers to my mouth. I remembered that day. The bright hospital lights, the smell of antiseptic, Dad's hand wrapped around mine as he told me to be brave. I never knew he'd taken a test. I never knew he'd carried that secret to protect me. Vivian's lips moved soundlessly. Her eyes darted to Dexter, then to the casket. For the first time since I'd met her, she looked small. Mr. Holbrook paused, his eyes lifting from the page. Sterling also left a recorded message, he said. He wanted everyone here to hear his own voice, his words. Vivian tried again, desperate now. This is outrageous! You can't... But her protest was drowned out by the faint click of the digital recorder. Then my father's voice filled the cemetery. Hello, everyone. If you're hearing this, then Vivian has done what I prayed she wouldn't, used my death to hurt my daughter. So let me set the record straight. The tone was unmistakable, calm, steady, tinged with the authority of a man who built his life on truth. Even through the faint echo of a recording, he sounded alive. I felt something inside me fracture. Vivian, his voice said, I know Dexter isn't mine. I've known since the first year of our marriage, when you left your diary open on our bed. You wrote about a man named Rex, the personal trainer you were still seeing while we were newlyweds. I read how you called him your escape, how you promised you'd find a way to make sure he was cared for. You hid payments to him in our joint account, labeling them as fitness training. I confronted you, and you denied it. I forgave you because I wanted to believe our marriage could be built on honesty. I was wrong. Gasps rippled again. Dexter's smirk was gone now, his face pale. Mom? He whispered, barely audible. What is he talking about? Vivian didn't answer. Her eyes were wild, her breath shallow. Dad's voice pressed on. I stayed in that marriage not because I was blind, but because I made vows, and because I loved that boy, even knowing he wasn't mine. I thought I could teach him what a father should be. I hoped Vivian might learn what love looks like, but she never did. The silence was so absolute that I could hear the leaves scraping along the ground. Vivian swayed slightly, clutching her folder like a lifeline. Now, my father's voice softened. About Noelle. Yes, her mother and I had different blood types. That's because Angela's biological family was different from the one that raised her. But make no mistake, Noelle is my daughter. I confirmed it when she was 8 years old. The results are in my lawyer's possession, notarized and certified. I also left copies with the court. Holbrook held up this document then. The paper stamped, dated, official. The murmurs that followed were quieter this time, like a collective exhale from people who didn't know which side to believe anymore. Vivian's lips trembled. This is fake. Dad's voice spoke again, sharp and unrelenting. Vivian, you've built your life on manipulation and half-truths. You think control equals love. You think inheritance equals worth. But you're wrong. Noelle inherits because she earned it. She stood beside me when you were plotting. She worked for what you only coveted. Dexter flinched. I saw confusion in his eyes. Shock, betrayal, maybe even shame. I forgive you, Vivian, Dad's voice said. For the affairs, the lies, the cruelty. I forgive you for poisoning Dexter against me. Because forgiveness is something you can't steal. But you will not take my daughter's name, her inheritance, or her peace. The stores, the house, everything stands as written in my will. If you try to contest it, know that copies of this recording, along with your security footage of you threatening to erase the biological daughter, have been submitted to my lawyer and the district attorney. Vivian froze. The color drained completely from her face. Rex may have been your secret, my father finished, his voice steady and final. But truth has a way of coming home. And Noelle, if you're hearing this, remember what I always told you. Love builds, hate destroys. Don't let her bitterness steal your joy. You are my greatest achievement. I love you, kiddo." Then there was a click, small but absolute. No one moved, even the wind had died. Vivian's eyes darted from the casket to the recorder, then to the crowd that stared at her with silent judgment. She stumbled back, her heels sinking into the damp grass. Dexter stood frozen, staring at me. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked like he didn't know where to stand, or who he was standing with. Vivian turned, muttered something I couldn't hear, and walked toward her car, her steps uneven, her composure gone. Mr. Holbrook closed the folder. "Sterling wanted this truth to come out in the light," he said quietly. "Now it has." And as the rain began to fall, I looked down at my father's grave, whispering words I hadn't said since I was a child. "You still fixed it, Dad, even now." Rain came harder after Vivian left, thin, silver needles blurring the edges of everything. The mourners stayed, though, as if the truth had glued them to the ground. For a long time, no one spoke. Then the pastor cleared his throat, said a prayer about forgiveness, and motioned for the casket to be lowered the rest of the way. The rope squeaked, the wood creaked. It was the final sound of a door closing. But my father's voice still lingered in the air. Even through the hiss of the rain, I could hear it. I could feel it. He had anticipated every lie Vivian would tell, every cruel word she'd use to break me. He hadn't left me unguarded, not even in death. People began to drift away in small clusters, whispering in low voices. Aunt Greta pressed my hand and said quietly, "Your father was a good man. Don't let them rewrite his story." Uncle Theodore walked her to the car, muttering something about never trusting a polished smile. Cousin Mallory stayed with me, helping me pick the petals off a bouquet Vivian had left on the casket before her performance. Each white lily now looked more like a symbol of guilt than sympathy. Dexter stood several yards away, his expensive suit soaked through, looking at the casket as if trying to solve an equation that wouldn't balance. His smirk was gone. His mother was gone. What was left was just a boy who'd lost the only version of truth he'd ever known. He opened his mouth like he wanted to say something, then thought better of it. He turned, walked to the black Mercedes, and slammed the door hard enough to make everyone flinch. Mr. Holbrook approached me slowly, his umbrella tilted against the wind. "He planned everything, Noelle," he said, voice low. "Every word you heard today was written 6 months ago. He came to my office twice after that, just to make sure it was sealed properly." "He knew she'd try this," I said quietly. "He suspected it," he corrected, "but he knew she'd regret it." A faint, sad smile crossed his lips. Sterling was one of the most thorough men I've ever met. He believed in preparing for storms before they came. He told me, if love can't stop a lie, proof will. I looked down at my father's handwriting still visible on the envelope, and something inside me shifted. The pain was still there, sharp and deep, but beneath it was something else. Steadiness. Vindication, maybe, or peace, finally given form. We left the cemetery together, Holbrook walking me to my car like a father would. The rain slicked the road ahead, but I drove slowly, deliberately. My hands stopped shaking halfway home. That night, I sat in the living room of my father's house, the house that was now legally mine, and stared at the framed photo of us at my college graduation. He had his arm around me, that proud half smile on his face, the kind that meant, "I told you you could do it." The letter lay on the coffee table, edges curling slightly where the rain had hit it. I read it again, every word, every stroke of his handwriting. When I reached the last line, "You are my greatest achievement," I pressed my fingers to it like a blessing. Down the hall, the grandfather clock struck midnight. The sound echoed through the house that suddenly felt both too large and too empty. The next morning, Vivian's car was gone from the driveway. By afternoon, her wardrobe was missing from the closet, her jewelry case emptied, her perfume no longer haunting the hallway. She didn't even bother leaving a note. But Dexter stayed. He didn't come home that first night, or the next. But on the third evening, when I was organizing my father's files in the study, I heard a knock. It was hesitant. 2 soft taps, then silence. When I opened the door, he stood there drenched from another evening storm. His tie was gone, his hair a wet mess. His face looked younger, almost unfamiliar without the arrogance. "Can I come in?" he asked. I hesitated for a long second, then stepped aside. He walked into the study, like someone entering a place he didn't deserve to be. His eyes moved across the photos on the walls. Dad holding me as a baby, Dad shaking hands with customers, Dad standing with both of us the first year after the wedding, when we still pretended to be a happy family. I didn't know, he said quietly, about Rex, about the diary, any of it. She told me he hated me, that he only kept me around to look good in public. I swallowed. And you believed her? He nodded. Yeah, I did. She made it sound so convincing. I thought, if I acted like him, maybe she'd finally be proud of me. The words hit harder than I expected. She used you, Dexter, I said softly, the way she used everyone. He looked at the floor. He was my dad too, wasn't he? Even if the DNA said otherwise. He was, I said. The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was fragile, like we were both standing on the same cracked ice and trying not to break it further. After a while, Dexter said, I want to work at the stores. Not for money, not for inheritance, just to help. I blinked. You want to work there? Yeah, the old way. Start at the bottom, like he did with you. I want to earn it. For the first time in a long time, I saw something real in his face. All right, I said finally, but you start Monday. Minimum wage, morning shift. You'll learn from Thomas at the front counter. He's been there since Grandpa Caldwell opened the first store. Dexter almost smiled. Deal. When he left, the house felt a little less empty. The next week, he showed up on time, every day. He stocked shelves, carried boxes, cleaned the floors, and listened more than he talked. The older employees eyed him suspiciously at first, but I watched how his shoulders slowly relaxed when customers thanked him. He started remembering names, just like Dad did. One afternoon, I found him standing at the workbench, fixing a broken power drill. His hands were covered in grease, but his expression was focused, peaceful. Not bad, I said. He looked up, startled, then smiled a little. Guess I'm learning from the best. For a moment, I saw him not as Vivian's son, but as a reflection of the man who'd raised us both. Later that night, Mr. Holbrook called. Vivian won't contest the will, he said. She's already moved out of state. Apparently she's staying with her sister in Nevada. Good, I murmured, though a small part of me didn't believe she was done. People like Vivian didn't just disappear. They regrouped. Still, life slowly began to normalize. The stores reopened under my management. The employees rallied behind me. And for the first time since Dad's death, the Caldwell name didn't feel like a weight. It felt like a legacy again. On Friday evenings, Dexter and I would close the store together. We'd count the register, lock the front door, and sit on the back steps drinking coffee from the vending machine. Sometimes we'd talk about Dad. Sometimes we didn't need to. Do you ever think about her? I asked once, meaning Vivian. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, every day. But it's different now. I used to defend her. Now I just feel sorry for her. I nodded. Yeah, me too. We sat in silence after that, listening to the hum of the streetlights. It struck me then how grief can shapeshift, how it can start as rage, turn to sorrow, and settle into something like forgiveness, even when you never planned to forgive. That night, as I locked up, I whispered a quiet promise to Dad's photo hanging by the register. I'll keep this place running. I'll protect it. I'll protect him too. The hardware stores still smelled like sawdust and oil, like possibility. But now there was something new in the air, a sense of rebuilding, of roots regrowing after a storm. And though the ghosts of betrayal still lingered, for the first time in months, I didn't feel haunted. I felt chosen. The first few months after the funeral moved like a long exhale, one I hadn't realized I'd been holding for years. Vivian had vanished completely, leaving behind only a closet full of hangers and a faint trace of her perfume on the guest room curtains. The movers came to pack her things. I stood at the window and watched them carry away each piece of her curated life, designer dresses, jewelry, the ivory piano she never learned to play. Dexter and I kept the stores running. At first, his presence unsettled the employees. He'd been the golden boy once, the heir apparent who never lifted a hammer, and now he was pushing carts of lumber under fluorescent lights. But he didn't flinch. He came in early, stayed late, asked questions, and listened. Slowly, suspicion thawed into tolerance. Still, there were cracks, moments when the past crept in. Like the day the mail arrived with an envelope addressed to the Caldwell estate. No return address. Inside, a single piece of paper. You can't build anything solid on lies. Typed, unsigned. I remember Dexter's face as he read it over my shoulder. She sent this, he said. It has to be her. Maybe, I said, though my chest tightened. The words felt more like a threat than advice. Holbrook told me to ignore it. If she wanted to contest, she'd have done it already. Let the silence speak. But silence can be loud when you're waiting for the next storm. One morning, a month later, a government inspector showed up at the main store. Anonymous complaint, unsafe work conditions, unpaid overtime, improper safety measures. I felt the air go cold around me as he spoke. Dexter's knuckles whitened as he gripped the counter. We spent 2 hours walking the aisles with clipboards and measuring tapes. The inspector checked ladders, wiring, break room logs. Nothing. Everything was compliant. When he left, he smiled faintly. "Someone clearly doesn't like you," he said. "But your father ran this place tight. Keep it that way." After he left, Dexter sat on the curb outside the store, head in his hands. Rain threatened again, the air thick with that pre-storm quiet. "She's still pulling strings," he muttered. "She won't stop until she destroys what's left of him." I sat beside him. "Then she'll fail, because what's left of him is us." He looked up at me, disbelief flickering into something softer. "You really think that?" "I know it." It was strange, that moment. Two people who'd once been enemies, now sitting side by side on the same cracked pavement, the same grief between them like shared language. Over the next few weeks, Dexter kept surprising me. He learned the names of every employee. He started fixing customers' small appliances after hours. Fans, drills, even an old radio a widow brought in, just to see if it could hum again. He never charged anyone. "Dad used to say some things are worth more than the sale," he told me one night, wiping grease from his hands. "Guess I finally get it." I smiled. "Took you long enough." He grinned back, but it was the kind of grin that carried weight, a quiet apology tucked inside. The first Saturday we closed early, I suggested we visit the original store together. It was the oldest one, Dad's pride, the place where his portrait still hung above the register. We walked through the aisles in silence. The floors creaked. The air smelled like pine and steel. Dexter stopped in front of the wall of framed photos, Dad shaking hands with customers, ribbon cuttings, Little League sponsorships. His fingers brushed over one of them. Dad and me, standing in front of the shop sign when I was 8. "He really loved you," Dexter said quietly. "And he loved you too," I said. He shook his head. "I don't know if I deserve that." "He chose it," I replied. "You don't have to earn what was freely given." His eyes glassed over for a moment, and I realized it was the first time he'd let himself grieve. Not for the inheritance, but for the man he'd lost. That night, we locked up the store and went for dinner at the diner across the street. The waitress recognized us. She'd served Dad his usual coffee and slice of apple pie every Thursday for years. "I'm sorry for your loss," she said, setting down our plates. "He was a good man. Always tipped too much, said it was for the pie fund." Dexter laughed softly, shaking his head. "Yeah, that sounds like him." We talked for hours, about Dad, about the years that led us here. He told me stories I'd never heard, how Sterling had come to his baseball games, even when Vivian said he was too busy. How he'd shown up at Dexter's school career day, proud as ever, talking about building things with your hands. "I thought he was embarrassing back then," Dexter said, staring at his coffee. "Now I'd give anything to hear him talk about torque wrenches again." I smiled, but the ache in my chest was deep. "He'd be proud of you." "Yeah?" "Yeah," I said firmly, "because you finally figured out what he was trying to teach us both. Family isn't about blood. It's about showing up." For a moment, it felt like the world exhaled with us. 2 weeks later, while cleaning out the storage room at home, Dexter found an envelope wedged behind an old toolbox. My name wasn't on it. It was addressed to him. He brought it to me, eyes wide. "It's his handwriting," he said. The paper was yellowed, the ink smudged at the corners. The date at the top, 2 years before Dad's death. "Open it," I said. He hesitated, then carefully tore the seal. Inside were 2 pages written in Dad's unmistakable script. He cleared his throat and began to read aloud. "Dexter, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I'm writing because there are things I may never get to say. You may already know I'm not your biological father. But I hope by now you've learned that biology is the least important thing about family. I chose you, Dex. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to." Dexter's voice faltered. He wiped his eyes, then continued. "It wasn't always easy. You resisted me. Your mother's bitterness built walls between us faster than I could tear them down. But I saw pieces of who you really were when you stayed late to help Mrs. Patterson load lumber, even though your friends were waiting. When you volunteered to coach that Little League team. When you didn't think anyone was watching. Those moments told me everything I needed to know. You are not your mother's mistakes. You are not Rex's shadow. You are mine, not by blood, but by choice. And I hope someday you'll see that choosing love is braver than any inheritance." Dexter stopped reading. His shoulders shook once, and he pressed his palms to his eyes. "I didn't deserve him," he whispered. I walked over and placed a hand on his shoulder. "He didn't love us because we deserved it. He loved us because he chose to." He looked up at me, tears streaking down his face, and for the first time, he didn't look like the boy who'd sneered at me from across the dinner table. He looked like my brother. We sat on the floor, surrounded by boxes, the letter between us. For a long time, neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere in the distance, but it didn't sound threatening anymore. It sounded cleansing, like rain about to fall on soil, ready to grow something new. In that moment, I realized the truth my father had been trying to teach all along. Family isn't what you inherit. It's what you build together from the ruins. And for the first time since the funeral, I felt ready to build again. By the end of that summer, the rhythm of our lives began to sound almost normal again. The stores ran smoothly, customers smiled when they saw us together, and the staff started joking that the Caldwell kids were finally working in harmony. I didn't correct them. It felt right. Dexter had changed. He laughed more easily now, carried himself with something quieter than pride, something closer to peace. There were still moments when guilt shadowed his face, but I'd learned to let them pass without dragging them into conversation. Some wounds need time more than words. One evening, as we were closing up the main store, he approached me holding another envelope. His expression was unreadable. "It was in the bottom drawer of Dad's old desk," he said, "addressed to both of us this time." The handwriting stopped me cold, strong and deliberate, the way he'd always signed school permission slips or grocery lists. The sight alone could still make my chest tighten. We opened it together at the counter, the hum of the overhead lights the only sound. It wasn't long, just one page, but every line carried the kind of weight only my father could write. "Noelle and Dexter, if you're reading this, it means you've found your way back to each other. I pray that day has already come. You were both my children, each in your own way. Noelle, my anchor. Dexter, my lesson in forgiveness. You will have chances to be angry. You'll have reason to hate what's been done to you. But anger won't build what I've left in your care. Love will. Remember that family is not what you're born into. It's what you choose to fight for. Protect each other, work hard, laugh often, and keep the stores alive, not for money, but for the people who still need them. I'm proud of you both." "Dad!" Neither of us spoke for a long time. The air between us felt holy somehow, like the kind of silence that belongs to churches and graveyards. Finally, Dexter whispered, "He really did think of everything, didn't he?" I smiled through the tears I hadn't realized were falling. He always did. Later that week, we had dinner at the house. Our house now. We sat at the same table where Dad had once said, "No matter what anyone tells you, you're my daughter." The same table where Vivian used to play hostess, turning warmth into performance. Now it was just 2 plates, 2 glasses, and the hum of quiet understanding. "I've been seeing a therapist," Dexter said suddenly, staring into his drink. "She says I was emotionally abused, that Mom used me as a weapon against him, against you." I nodded slowly. "She's right. I hate her for that," he said, his voice small. "But I also miss her. Is that messed up?" "No," I said softly. "It's human." He sighed. "Dad saw it, didn't he? He knew what she was doing." "Yes," I said, "and he never stopped loving you for it." Dexter rubbed a hand over his face. "I don't know how to live with that kind of grace." "Then start by learning from it," I said. "That's what I'm doing." He smiled faintly. "You sound like him." I took that as the highest compliment he could give. That night, after he left, I found myself wandering through the house, turning off lights one by one. When I reached Dad's office, I stopped. The air in there still smelled faintly of pine wood and ink. The photograph on the wall, the one of him teaching me how to hold a hammer when I was 5, had a fine layer of dust. I wiped it clean. For a second, I thought about the sealed envelope Mr. Holbrook had mentioned, the one to be opened 5 years after Dad's death. It was strange knowing there were still words from him waiting somewhere, like a time capsule of love set aside for another version of me. Before heading upstairs, I stepped out onto the porch. The night air was cool and quiet. Across the street, a few lights glowed in the windows of the diner. I thought about all the people Dad had helped, the neighbors who came to the stores not just for tools, but for advice, for stories, for comfort. And I thought about Vivian. I hadn't heard from her since the funeral, though rumors trickled in. Someone said she'd been spotted at a casino in Reno. Another claimed she was trying to sell jewelry she couldn't prove she owned. None of it surprised me. What did surprise me was how little anger I felt. For the first time, she wasn't living rent-free in my mind. Still, some nights, when the house went too quiet, I'd catch myself thinking about the ways she had orchestrated every fracture between us, how she'd stood over my father's grave and turned grief into a weapon. The memory still burned, but not the way it used to. It had cooled into a scar. A week later, I got a text from an unknown number. "Tell your brother to stop pretending. Some lies never die. R." I stared at it for a long time, my pulse pounding in my ears. R. There was only one person that could be, Rex. I deleted the message, then blocked the number. I didn't show it to Dexter. There was no point. The ghost of their deception could haunt me, but it didn't need to touch him again. Still, I couldn't help wondering what Rex wanted. Money? Revenge? Or maybe just attention from the woman who'd abandoned them both. That night, I double-checked the locks and stood at the window for a while, watching the wind move through the trees. 1,000 questions circled my mind, but only one truth anchored me. Whatever storm came next, Dad had already taught me how to build shelter. 2 days later, Dexter and I visited the cemetery. We brought fresh yellow roses, the color Dad always said looked like happiness, even on sad days. The grass had grown thick around the headstone. We cleaned it, trimmed the edges, and stood in silence. "He would have loved this," Dexter said. "Us?" I asked. "Yeah," he said. "Us. Together. No drama." "Yeah," I whispered. "He would have." As we left, the sun broke through the clouds, painting everything gold. For a moment, I swore I could hear Dad's voice, just a whisper, carried on the wind. "Keep building, kiddo." And I knew that's what we'd do, because storms end, grief softens, and families, real families, don't just survive the wreckage, they rebuild from it. A year passed before I realized how much life had changed since that day at the cemetery. The hardware stores thrived. Our employees stopped calling me Ms. Caldwell and started calling me Boss Noel. Dexter managed the original shop now, the one with the old oak tree out front, and every time I visited, I'd see him joking with customers, carrying lumber, or helping a kid pick out their first toolkit. He'd become exactly the kind of man my father had hoped he'd be. On the first anniversary of Dad's death, we went together to the cemetery. The grass had grown thick and green around the headstone. The inscription gleamed in the sunlight. Sterling Caldwell, beloved father. Love makes family. We brought yellow roses, just like last year. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the hum of distant traffic and birdsong. "He'd be proud of this," Dexter said, setting the flowers down carefully. "Us, the stores, all of it." "Yeah," I said quietly. "He'd love seeing how far we've come." We stood there for a long while in comfortable silence. "He thought of everything," Dexter murmured. "Even now, he's still teaching us." I nodded. He always will. When we finally turned to leave, I felt a strange calm, like I'd been holding my breath for an entire year and could finally let it go. That night, we had dinner together at the house. It had become a tradition by now. One Friday every month, we'd cook Dad's pot roast recipe, laugh about the terrible burnt versions from when we were still figuring it out, and talk about business and life. Between bites, Dexter looked up and said, "Holbrook called me today." I set down my fork. "About what?" "He said there's another letter, from Dad, to be opened on the 5th anniversary of his death. Apparently he wrote it the same week as the recording." A small smile tugged at my lips. "Of course he did. He never left anything unfinished." Dexter laughed softly. "Holbrook said, and I quote, he wanted to make sure you two never ran out of his advice." We both laughed, but it caught in my throat halfway through, because it was so him. Always preparing, always watching over us, even when he wasn't there. Later that evening, after Dexter left, I sat out on the porch with a mug of coffee and stared at the stars. The town was quiet, the kind of quiet that hums with peace rather than loneliness. The store's neon signs glowed faintly in the distance. It hit me then that everything I loved about my father was still alive, not just in memories, but in the things he built and the people he changed. He'd built a legacy out of kindness, honesty, and second chances. And now that legacy was ours to protect. The next morning, I stopped by the diner before heading to the store. The waitress, the same one who'd served Dad every Thursday, smiled when she saw me. "Coffee and apple pie?" she asked. "Of course," I said. When she set the plate down, I noticed something new. An old photo taped to the wall near the register. It was Dad, sitting at that very counter, coffee in one hand and pie in the other, smiling like he'd just finished fixing the world. "Someone dropped that off last week," she said. "Said he changed their life. Thought you'd like to see it." I did. I sat there for a long time after she left, tracing the edges of his smile with my eyes. It was strange how grief shifts over time, from something sharp and unbearable to something soft and steady, like a heartbeat you learn to live with. As I drove to the store, I thought about everything he'd said in his letter, the words that had turned my world upside down and then slowly put it back together. Family is what you choose to fight for. Love builds, hate destroys. Protect each other. I repeated them in my head like a prayer. When I walked into the store, Dexter was behind the counter, laughing with Thomas, our oldest employee. They were arguing about the right way to fix a stubborn drill bit, and for a moment, the air was so warm with laughter that I forgot we'd ever lived through storms. I stood there quietly watching. That's when it hit me. The legacy wasn't just about hardware or inheritance. It was about people, about showing up when it's hard, about choosing to love when it would be easier to walk away. Dad had known that. He'd lived it, and now so were we. Later that day, a customer came in, a middle-aged woman holding a small wooden stool. "My husband built this years ago," she said. "The leg's broken. I just can't bring myself to throw it away." Dexter smiled. "Then don't. Let's fix it." He guided her to the back workshop and started sanding the splintered edge. I watched from a distance, the sunlight slanting through the windows, painting everything gold. That scene, simple, unremarkable to anyone else, made my chest ache. Because it was proof that Dad was still here, alive in the rhythm of every act of kindness his stores inspired. That evening, as we locked up, I looked at Dexter and said, "He'd be proud of you, you know?" He looked down, smiling a little. "Yeah? You think so?" "I don't think. I know." We stepped outside. The sunset stretched wide across the horizon, the same orange and gold Dad used to call God showing off. As we walked toward our cars, Dexter said, "You ever wonder what that 5-year letter says?" "All the time," I admitted, "but I think it's meant for the version of us who'll read it then." He nodded. "Guess we'll just have to keep making him proud until we find out." "Deal," I said, and we shook on it. Two siblings bound not by blood, but by choice, by love, and by the legacy of a man who taught us what those words truly meant. As I drove home that night, I rolled down the window. The air smelled faintly of sawdust and rain, the scent of work and renewal. Somewhere in that mix, I could almost hear my father's laughter, the quiet, steady kind that meant everything was going to be all right. Because it was. Because we were. And because love, once chosen, never really dies.